What if the person watching everything was the only reason things didn't go too far? The morning air in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside San Diego carried a strange stillness, the kind that usually meant nothing unusual ever happened here. Yet within seconds that illusion would begin to break. Alicia Carter stepped out from the front of her home, holding a small set of keys and a grocery bag, moving with calm familiarity as she prepared for a routine day, unaware that the atmosphere around her street was already shifting in a way she could not see. Across the sidewalk, Officer Daniel Brooks had already positioned his patrol vehicle slightly angled toward the curb, his posture rigid, his attention fixed on her with a level of scrutiny that did not match the ordinary setting. To any passerby, it looked like a routine patrol, but the tension in his stance suggested something more uncertain beneath the surface. Alicia paused when she noticed him watching, her expression steady but curious, as if trying to understand why attention had suddenly narrowed onto her in a place she had lived for years without incident. Daniel Brooks stepped forward, maintaining professional distance, yet his tone carried an edge of control that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, though his eyes never fully softened. Alicia responded politely, her voice calm and measured, asking if something was wrong, because from her perspective there was no reason for this interaction to escalate beyond a greeting. Behind the curtain of normalcy, however, subtle signals were already unfolding in the environment. A few neighbors slowed their movements, sensing something unusual in the interaction, though no one could quite define what it was. Curtains shifted slightly in nearby homes as people observed from a distance, drawn not by chaos but by uncertainty. Far beyond the immediate street, unseen from the direct line of sight, Michael Reed stood partially concealed near a parked vehicle 2 blocks away, his presence unnoticed by both Alicia and Officer Brooks. Beside him, a disciplined military working dog named Rex remained still, alert but silent, tracking the emotional and procedural rhythm of the scene rather than reacting outwardly. Reed's eyes remained focused on the interaction in the distance, not interfering, not signaling, simply observing with the kind of trained patience that came from years of reading situations before they escalated into something irreversible. There was something about the officer's posture that did not align with standard engagement protocol, and Reed recognized it immediately without needing to hear a single word spoken. Alicia, meanwhile, remained grounded in place, unaware that her ordinary morning had become the center of multiple intersecting perspectives. Officer Brooks asked another question, slightly more direct this time, requesting clarification about her presence in the area, despite her standing directly in front of her own residence. The imbalance was subtle but growing, shaped not by actions, but by perception. And in the distance, unseen authority continued to watch, waiting for the moment when observation might need to become intervention. The silence that followed the initial exchange did not feel empty. It felt structured, as if every second was being measured by invisible observers who had not yet revealed themselves. Alicia Carter remained standing near her front steps, holding her grocery bag slightly tighter now, not from fear, but from confusion, as Officer Daniel Brooks continued to occupy the space between her and her own home with an insistence that felt increasingly disproportionate to the setting. His questions became more detailed, shifting from simple identification to repeated verification, as though the ordinary context of a residential street was being reinterpreted through an unfamiliar lens. Alicia answered each question clearly, her voice steady, her posture unchanged, yet the interaction around her was beginning to attract a quiet gravitational pull. A neighbor across the street paused while watering plants, another slowed while walking a dog, and within moments, the subtle rhythm of the neighborhood began to fracture into observation. Officer Brooks adjusted his stance, glancing briefly at his radio, as if confirming something. Unseen, then returning his attention to Alicia with renewed scrutiny. The environment itself remained calm, but the emotional temperature of the scene was rising in layers that were not immediately visible. In the distance, 2 blocks away, Michael Reed remained stationary beside his vehicle, his gaze locked on the interaction with a precision that suggested he was reading more than just behavior. He was reading structure. Beside him, K9 Rex maintained a controlled, alert posture, not reacting impulsively, but tracking subtle shifts in human tone, movement, and spacing. Reed did not move forward, nor did he signal any immediate response, because what he was observing was still within a threshold of uncertainty rather than confirmed escalation. However, there was a detail in Officer Brooks' pattern of engagement that caught his attention: repetition without progression, a cycle of questioning that did not resolve into clarity. Alicia, unaware of the distant observer, began to notice something more subtle in her immediate environment. Not just the officer's words, but the way space itself was being controlled around her. The sidewalk felt narrower, the air slightly heavier, not because of physical change, but because of attention being concentrated on her from multiple directions. Officer Brooks requested verification of residency, a standard procedural step, yet the way it was delivered carried an unnecessary rigidity that made the request feel less like confirmation and more like challenge. Alicia calmly gestured toward her home, stating that she lived there, had lived there for years, and could provide any documentation needed, her tone remaining respectful but increasingly firm. A brief pause followed, during which Officer Brooks appeared to reassess rather than respond, as if internal expectations were not aligning with the reality in front of him. In the distant observation point, Michael Reed slightly shifted his stance for the first time, a minimal adjustment that indicated heightened attention rather than action. Rex remained steady, eyes fixed forward, reading the emotional temperature of the scene. Nothing had crossed into overt conflict, yet the alignment of attention, authority, and observation had created a layered structure around Alicia that she could feel but not fully see. The neighborhood remained physically unchanged, but psychologically, the moment had already begun to tilt towards something more complex than a simple inquiry. The tension that had been quietly building along the suburban street began to shift into a more defined structure, not through action but through awareness, as if every participant in the scene had unknowingly stepped into a shared frame of observation. Alicia Carter stood firm in front of her home, maintaining her calm posture, her expression steady despite the increasingly repetitive nature of Officer Daniel Brooks' questioning. His tone remained controlled, but the lack of progression in his inquiries had begun to reveal a subtle imbalance between procedure and perception. Instead of resolving uncertainty, each question seemed to reinforce it, creating a loop that drew attention not only from Alicia, but from the surrounding environment. A nearby resident paused entirely now, no longer pretending to continue routine activity, while another stepped partially behind a fence line to observe more discreetly. The street, once ordinary and predictable, had become a space of silent evaluation. Officer Brooks adjusted his position slightly closer to the curb, his stance still authoritative, but now carrying a faint tension that suggested he was aware of being observed beyond the immediate interaction. Alicia responded again with clarity, reiterating her residence, her history in the neighborhood, and her willingness to provide verification if required, her tone remaining composed yet increasingly aware that explanation alone was not resolving the situation. The distance between explanation and acceptance was beginning to widen. In the background, far beyond the immediate residential line, Michael Reed remained in his concealed observation position with K9 Rex, both maintaining absolute stillness. Reed's attention had sharpened further, not because of any single action, but because of pattern recognition emerging across the interaction. The lack of procedural resolution combined with the increasing attention from bystanders indicated a shift from routine engagement to situational distortion. Rex remained focused, head slightly lowered but alert, responding to the emotional tone of the environment rather than any visible threat. Reed did not intervene, but his posture indicated readiness had increased by a measurable degree. Officer Brooks, meanwhile, appeared to recalibrate his approach, briefly glancing toward his surroundings as if reassessing not just Alicia, but the environment itself. His questions slowed for a moment, then resumed with a slightly altered cadence, suggesting internal uncertainty beneath external authority. Alicia noticed this change, not as confirmation of resolution, but as recognition that the interaction had entered a more complex stage than either party had initially intended. The neighborhood's silence was no longer passive. It was participatory, with each observer contributing to the psychological weight of the moment. A child standing near a driveway pulled back toward a parent, sensing tension without understanding its origin. The air remained physically unchanged, but the social structure of the street had shifted into layers of observation, interpretation, and delayed reaction. In the distance, Reed's position remained unchanged, yet his awareness continued to track every subtle shift in tone, spacing, and behavior, building a clearer picture of an encounter that was no longer simply procedural. Alicia stood at the center of it all, grounded but increasingly aware that the situation around her was being defined by forces extending beyond her immediate view. The moment continued to unfold with a quiet intensity that no single participant had fully chosen, yet all were now part of, as if the neighborhood itself had become a silent stage for competing interpretations of the same reality. Alicia Carter remained positioned in front of her home, her stance unchanged, grounded in familiarity with the space that surrounded her, yet increasingly aware that familiarity alone no longer guaranteed clarity in how she was being perceived. Officer Daniel Brooks maintained his position near the curb, his authority still outwardly intact, but the rhythm of his engagement had begun to lose its earlier certainty. His questions were now spaced differently, less direct in sequence, suggesting a recalibration of intent rather than continuation of procedure. He looked briefly toward the surrounding houses, noticing the presence of neighbors who were no longer casually passing by, but instead observing with deliberate attention. That awareness added an additional layer of pressure to the interaction, though it remained unspoken. Alicia responded once more with calm precision, reiterating the same facts she had already provided, her voice steady and her expression composed, but now carrying a subtle firmness that indicated she was not yielding to repetition. The situation was no longer defined by a simple exchange of questions and answers. It had evolved into a test of perception, where each repetition carried less informational value and more emotional weight. In the distance, Michael Reed maintained his position with K9 Rex, both remaining fully still, but the internal assessment within Reed's focus had become more defined. The pattern he was observing now included not just the officer's behavior, but the surrounding social response, which was gradually amplifying without any explicit trigger. Rex remained attentive, responding to the emotional structure of the environment rather than any direct command, his posture reflecting controlled readiness without escalation. Reed did not intervene, but his attention had shifted from passive observation to analytical certainty that the situation was entering a critical interpretive phase. Officer Brooks subtly adjusted his stance again, this time shifting his weight and briefly breaking eye contact with Alicia before returning to it, a movement small enough to go unnoticed individually, but significant within the broader pattern of behavior. Alicia noticed this change not as relief, but as uncertainty taking form on the opposite side of the interaction. The surrounding neighborhood, now fully engaged in observation, contributed to a collective stillness that magnified every gesture and pause. No one spoke loudly, yet the silence itself became a form of participation, shaping how the moment was being experienced collectively. The environment remained physically unchanged, but psychologically it had tightened into a focused point of attention where authority, perception, and observation intersected without resolution. In the distance, Reed's posture remained unchanged, but his internal assessment had reached a threshold where observation alone might no longer remain sufficient if the pattern continued to develop without correction. Min Kong the Zak Nen Hok Lap Lai Kak Sui Don Mang Tin Zak Den Vi Mao De Qua, Nen Vat Hok, Kui Chup Han 6 Fan Beat Doi Su Theo, Chung, Tak Nu Mot Fan, Thiat Lap Ko Din Cho Ka Chien. Tai Nien, Min Ko the Jup Ban Zay Dung Noi Dung Theo Hong and Tone, Trung Lap, Va Van Ju Dung Motif, Nen Vat, Va Mok Kich Ban Ma Ban Dang Fat, Try and Show YouTube. The afternoon sunlight over the suburban street felt unusually still, as if the entire neighborhood had paused to listen. The black woman continued forward on her bicycle at a steady pace, her posture calm, her attention aware but not alarmed. The white officer, positioned near the sidewalk, watched her approach with a rigid posture that suggested authority but also uncertainty. The atmosphere carried a quiet tension, not from any action, but from the way assumptions and awareness seemed to collide in the same narrow space. Inside a nearby parked vehicle, a Navy SEAL observed everything without revealing his presence. His trained eyes tracked posture, spacing, and intent, reading the situation with disciplined calm rather than emotion. Beside him, A military working dog remained still, alert, and focused, sensing the subtle shifts in energy that humans often missed. The woman slowed slightly as she neared the officer, maintaining respectful distance while keeping her balance on the bicycle. The officer spoke, his tone firm, and gestured as if establishing boundaries, though the exact cause of concern was not clearly visible to those farther away. The woman responded with controlled composure, her voice steady and deliberate, showing no signs of panic or aggression. The SEAL noted every detail, recognizing how quickly misunderstandings in public spaces could escalate when communication lacked clarity. He remained in place, assessing whether intervention was necessary or whether the situation could resolve itself through dialogue. The dog shifted its head slightly, reacting to the tone of voices rather than volume, indicating heightened awareness but not distress. The woman placed one foot on the ground to stabilize her bicycle, maintaining eye contact while ensuring her body language remained open and non-threatening. The officer adjusted his stance, still maintaining authority but showing subtle hesitation as the exchange continued. The environment around them remained unchanged, yet the emotional weight of the moment grew through silence between spoken words. A passing car slowed briefly, then continued, unaware of the deeper tension unfolding just beyond its window. The SEAL's attention narrowed, not because of danger, but because of the importance of timing and judgment in moments where perception could easily become misunderstanding. The woman's expression remained composed, reflecting a mixture of awareness and restraint, as if she understood that escalation would not serve anyone present. The officer lowered his hand slightly, as though reconsidering his approach, while still maintaining professional distance. The air felt heavy with unresolved intent, but not with action. The SEAL remained ready, but patient, recognizing that presence alone can sometimes influence outcomes without intervention. The dog remained motionless, its focus unwavering, mirroring the stillness of its handler. In that moment, the neighborhood felt suspended between explanation and assumption, between authority and observation, where every participant waited for clarity to emerge naturally rather than be forced. The quiet between them stretched longer, not because anything new had happened, but because everyone involved was finally paying closer attention to what was already there. The woman on the bicycle remained steady, her breathing controlled, her posture unchanged, as if she had long learned how to remain composed in moments when others misread calm as defiance. The officer's stance shifted again, this time less rigid, his attention moving between her face and the surrounding environment as if reassessing the situation from a different angle. Inside the parked vehicle, the Navy SEAL observed the micro changes in behavior that often revealed more truth than spoken words ever could. He noticed the officer was no longer leaning forward with certainty, but instead holding a position of reconsideration, a subtle sign that initial judgment was being reevaluated in real time. The dog beside him remained still, yet its ears tracked every shift in tone and movement outside, responding not to threat, but to emotional fluctuation. The woman spoke again, her voice calm and deliberate, offering clarification rather than resistance. Her words measured in a way that suggested she was not trying to win a confrontation, but resolve a misunderstanding. The officer listened more than he interrupted this time, his head tilting slightly, as if processing information that had not been fully considered before. The SEAL's attention narrowed further, recognizing a familiar pattern in human interaction where authority, perception, and context can initially collide before aligning again through communication. He noted that no one was escalating, despite the tension that had existed only moments earlier, and that restraint was now the dominant force in the space. A brief silence followed, filled only by distant neighborhood sounds, leaves shifting in a light breeze, and the faint hum of a passing vehicle further down the street. The woman adjusted her grip on the bicycle handlebars, not as a defensive action, but as a grounding one, maintaining balance both physically and emotionally. The officer lowered his hand completely now, no longer signaling control, but instead transitioning into conversation. His tone softened, still professional, but no longer sharp, indicating that the situation was moving from assumption toward clarification. The SEAL recognized this shift immediately as a de-escalation phase, where understanding replaces uncertainty when enough patience is allowed into the moment. The dog relaxed slightly, though still alert, mirroring the change in energy rather than reacting to danger. The woman nodded once as she responded, acknowledging the exchange while maintaining her composed posture, her presence steady and unbroken. The officer stepped half a pace back, creating more physical space, which reflected an internal adjustment more than a tactical one. The neighborhood remained unaware of the significance of what was unfolding. As to any passerby, it would have appeared like a simple roadside conversation resolving itself. Yet for those paying attention closely, it was a sequence of perception being corrected in real time. The seal remained still, not because action was needed, but because observation had already revealed the outcome forming quietly in front of him. The moment settled into clarity, not through force or interruption, but through the gradual alignment of understanding between people who had briefly seen the same situation from different angles. The final stage of the encounter unfolded with a quiet sense of resolution, as if the entire situation had been slowly guided back into balance by patience rather than pressure. The woman remained on her bicycle, now fully steady, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes moving between the officer and the surrounding space with calm awareness. The officer stood at a more neutral distance than before, his earlier rigidity replaced by a professional composure that suggested the moment had shifted from suspicion to understanding. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a tone that was measured and no longer driven by urgency, indicating that clarification had replaced uncertainty. The woman responded with the same calm control she had maintained throughout, offering explanation in a way that was direct but not confrontational, ensuring that her words served to inform rather than escalate. Inside the parked vehicle, the Navy SEAL continued to observe without movement, recognizing that the most important phase of any interaction is often the point at which tension dissolves into clarity. He noted how the officer's shoulders had relaxed slightly, how his stance no longer projected confrontation, and how his attention now focused on understanding, rather than control. The dog beside him remained alert but calm, its posture softened as the emotional environment shifted away from tension. The SEAL understood that nothing external had forced this change. It had emerged entirely through communication and restraint. A brief pause settled over the group, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if each person involved was mentally reviewing the sequence of events that had just unfolded. The woman adjusted her position on the bicycle once more, this time signaling readiness to continue her day rather than prepare for further discussion. The officer gave a small nod, subtle but clear, acknowledging the exchange as complete without further instruction or restriction. The space between them felt lighter, as if the weight of assumption had been replaced by the simplicity of mutual recognition. In the background, the neighborhood carried on with ordinary activity, unaware of the significance of what had just been resolved in silence and conversation. The SEAL's gaze softened slightly, not from emotion, but from recognition that not every situation requires intervention to reach stability. The dog shifted its weight, then settled fully, reflecting the absence of perceived threat. The woman began to move forward on her bicycle, slowly at first, then with more natural rhythm as she regained full motion. The officer turned slightly away, returning to his original position, his role in the moment complete. The SEAL remained still until the woman had fully passed the immediate area, confirming that no further action was needed. The street returned to its ordinary rhythm, sunlight continuing to stretch across pavement and lawns, leaving behind only the memory of a moment that had briefly held tension and then resolved through communication. What remained was not conflict, but the quiet reminder that awareness, restraint, and understanding can shift the direction of any situation before it becomes something irreversible. The late afternoon light settled more softly across the neighborhood as the moment that had drawn so much attention finally dissolved into ordinary life. The woman on the bicycle continued forward along the street at an easy pace, her movements steady and unhurried, as if reclaiming the rhythm of her day with each rotation of the wheels. Behind her, the officer remained near the sidewalk, now fully composed, his posture neutral and his attention no longer fixed on any single point. The interaction had ended without escalation, leaving behind only the quiet imprint of clarity where uncertainty had briefly existed. Inside the parked vehicle, the Navy SEAL observed the final transitions without movement, his focus shifting from analysis to conclusion as the environment returned to normalcy. The dog beside him relaxed completely, resting in a calm position that reflected the absence of tension in the surrounding space. The SEAL understood that what he had witnessed was not defined by confrontation, but by the gradual correction of perception through communication and restraint. The woman's figure grew smaller as she moved farther down the street, blending back into the everyday flow of the neighborhood. Nothing about her pace suggested urgency or distress, only continuity, as though the earlier exchange had not disrupted her sense of direction or purpose. The officer eventually turned away, resuming his original position and responsibilities, his presence once again part of the background rather than the center of attention. The SEAL remained still for a few more moments, ensuring that the environment had fully stabilized before considering departure. He noted how quickly a situation that had initially carried tension could resolve when space was allowed for explanation rather than assumption. The dog shifted slightly, then settled again, mirroring the final release of alertness in the environment. A light breeze moved through the trees lining the street, carrying with it the ordinary sounds of a quiet residential afternoon. A distant vehicle passed without slowing, unaware that anything significant had occurred nearby. The SEAL finally leaned back slightly, his observation complete, recognizing that no intervention had been required beyond presence and awareness. The events of the moment remained in his assessment not as conflict, but as a reminder of how fragile misunderstandings can be when filtered through incomplete information. The woman continued until she reached the next block, where she merged seamlessly into the broader movement of the neighborhood, indistinguishable from anyone else going about their day. The officer's figure became less prominent as distance and routine reasserted themselves. The SEAL's vehicle remained parked for a short while longer, not out of concern, but out of habit, confirming that stability had fully returned. Eventually, he signaled readiness to move on, and the dog responded with calm attentiveness, prepared to continue without hesitation. As they departed, the street behind them returned entirely to its original state, unchanged in appearance, yet marked by a brief sequence of human interaction that had resolved itself without force. What remained was a quiet understanding that awareness, patience, and measured communication can shift the outcome of any encounter before it defines itself as something larger than it needs to be.